The rain fell in silent, slick sheets against the city's glass towers, turning the neon glow of downtown into a watercolor blur. My own reflection was a ghost in the polished brass of the elevator doors, a pale, drawn woman with eyes too wide for her face, clutching a single white envelope as if it were a lifeline. It wasn't a lifeline. It was an anchor, and I was finally letting it go. This one act, this final confession, was meant to be the end of everything. The hallway on the 12th floor of the Sterling was hushed and anonymous, smelling faintly of lemon polish and wealth. Each door was a slab of dark, unforgiving wood, identical to the next. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I found the number etched on a small, tasteful plaque, 1204, Julian's latest address. I had never been here, but his transience was a part of his charm and a part of his deceit. He moved through apartments the way he moved through people, quickly and without leaving a trace. My fingers trembled as I knelt, the cool marble floor seeping through the thin fabric of my jeans. The envelope felt heavy, weighted with 12 months of secrets, of shame, of a silence that had corroded my soul from the inside out. It was all there, written in a hand that was barely my own, shaky and raw. A confession of the small, terrible crime he'd coaxed me into, the doctored accounting ledger, the decimal point moved just so, the lie I told to a man whose name I didn't even know, all to cover a debt Julian claimed would ruin him. It had ruined me instead. I slid the letter under the door, the paper whispered against the wood, then a soft thud as it landed on the other side. Silence. I waited, holding my breath, as if expecting an alarm to sound. Nothing. Just the distant hum of the city and the frantic beat of my own blood in my ears. I stood up, my legs unsteady. A profound, hollow lightness filled my chest. It was done. I turned and walked away without looking back. The elevator's quiet ding, a sound of finality, of escape. Freedom, I thought, tasted like rain and regret. My own apartment was small, a world away from the sterile luxury of the Sterling. It was a place of worn wooden floors, mismatched mugs, and the lingering scent of coffee and old books. It was my sanctuary, the one place the ghosts of the past year couldn't touch me. I made a cup of chamomile tea, my hands still not quite steady, and sat by the window, watching the storm wash the city clean. The letter was gone. Julian would read it, and he would either understand or he would rage. But either way, he would stay away. He knew as well as I did that the words in that letter could unravel us both. That was the point. It was a threat wrapped in a plea, a goodbye sealed with mutually assured destruction. For hours, I felt nothing but the slow, draining release of tension. I read a book, the words blurring on the page. I listened to the rain. I imagined my life stretching out before me again, a clean slate. The fear that had been my constant companion for a year had finally receded, leaving behind a quiet ache of exhaustion. I must have drifted off in the chair, because when I woke, the storm had passed, and the city was a tapestry of glittering lights under a bruised, indigo sky. A chill had settled in the room. That's when I saw it. It was on my doorstep. I hadn't heard a knock, hadn't heard the whisper of footsteps in the hall. It was simply there, propped against the dark wood of my door, as if it had materialized from the shadows. An envelope, thick and black, made of a heavy cardstock that felt like it could stop a blade. My name, Seraphine Lauren, was written across the front in a precise, elegant script. The ink was a stark, unforgiving silver. There was no address, no stamp. It had been hand-delivered. My blood ran cold. I knelt slowly, my gaze fixed on the wax seal on the back. It wasn't a family crest or a pretty design. It was a single stylized K, stark and severe. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and pulled out the single sheet of matching black card inside. The message was brief, the same silver ink forming letters that were more command than invitation. Dinner, 8 o'clock. I've read everything. Beneath the words was the name of a restaurant I'd only ever read about in magazines. Vespertine, a place where deals were made in hushed tones over $1,000 bottles of wine. An address followed. My heart seized. I've read everything. The phrase echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of my apartment. It couldn't be Julian. This display of quiet, menacing power was not his style. Julian was a creature of frantic excuses and borrowed charm. This was something else entirely. Cold, controlled. My first instinct was to call the police. But what would I say? That a stranger invited me to dinner? That he'd read a letter I'd illegally slid under someone's door? The confession in that letter, the one about creative accounting, could end my career, could land me in a courtroom answering questions I couldn't afford to answer. Panic clawed at my throat. I had put my return address on the back of the envelope, a stupid, reflexive habit from a lifetime of writing polite, normal letters. A mistake, a fatal one. I had no choice. The unspoken threat hung in the air between the perfectly penned words. To ignore the invitation was to call his bluff, and something told me this man did not bluff. At 7:30, I stood before my small closet, my body numb with dread. What does one wear to meet a monster? I chose a simple black dress, high-necked and severe, armor. I did my makeup with a steady hand that belied the terror churning in my gut. I was not the frightened girl who had written that letter. I was a professional, a woman in control. It was a lie, but it was the only one I had left. The taxi ride through the glistening post-rain streets was a blur. Vespertine was just as intimidating as the articles had described. No sign, just a single, unmarked mahogany door, tended by a doorman, who looked like he could snap a man in two without wrinkling his suit. He opened the door for me before I could speak my name. "Ms. Lauren," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They are waiting for you." My blood froze. They? The interior was dark and opulent, all black marble and deep crimson velvet. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet power. The maitre d', a man with a face as smooth and impassive as a marble statue, met me just inside. "This way, this way," he murmured, leading me not into the main dining room, but down a short private hall toward a secluded alcove. It was a table for two, set in a pool of soft, isolated light, offering a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline. A man was already seated, his back to me. He wore a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. As we approached, he stood, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow. He wasn't large or physically imposing in the way the doorman had been. His power was of a different kind. It was in his stillness, in the unnerving calm of his presence. He turned, and his eyes found mine. They were the color of smoke, intelligent and startlingly perceptive, as if they could see every mistake I had ever made. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, his dark hair cut short, his jawline sharp enough to be a weapon. "Ms. Lauren," he said. His voice was quiet, a low, resonant baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed. "Thank you for coming. I am Ronan Kyrell." The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it suggested it should. He gestured to the chair opposite him. I sat, my movements stiff. I felt like a fly caught in a web, the silken threads invisible but undeniably strong. He resumed his seat, his movements economical and precise. He didn't smile. He simply watched me, his gaze patient, unnerving. And there on the table beside his wineglass lay my letter. The white paper was a stark accusation against the black marble. My breath hitched. "I believe this is yours," he said, his voice betraying no emotion at all. He didn't push it toward me. He simply acknowledged its presence, a piece of evidence on a courtroom table. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my own voice a thin, reedy thing. "I am the man who lives at apartment 1204, he said calmly. "And you, it would seem, have a problem. You've confessed to the wrong person." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the information. The wrong door, the wrong man. A mistake of such catastrophic proportions that I couldn't even grasp its edges. My entire life had just tilted on its axis. Ronan Kyrell leaned forward slightly, the faint light catching the silver of his cufflinks. His smoky eyes held mine, and the look in them was not one of anger, but of something far more chilling, assessment. "You wrote this letter for Julian Croft," he stated, not a question. "You detailed how you helped him defraud one of my clients." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the air crackle with their weight. "You seem to think your confession was the end of a chapter. It is not. You have no idea what you have begun." The hum of the restaurant, which had been a low ambient murmur, faded to absolute silence. The only sound left in the world was the frantic, useless thumping of my own heart. The wrong person. The words were not an accusation, they were a verdict. My confession, meant to be a quiet implosion of my own making, had instead become a lit flare in the darkest corner of the city. And this man was the one who had seen it. I don't understand, I stammered, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. My mind was a frantic scramble of possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was he a lawyer? A private investigator? Ronan Kyrell watched me, his expression unreadable. He made a subtle gesture with his hand, and a waiter materialized out of the shadows, silent as a ghost. "The Barolo for me," Ronan said, his voice calm, never taking his eyes off me. "And for the lady, bring her the same. We'll have the tasting menu." The waiter simply nodded and vanished. He hadn't asked if I wanted wine. He hadn't asked if I was hungry. Ronan Kyrell did not ask. He decided. The simple act of ordering for me was a profound declaration of control. I was no longer a guest at this table. I was a piece on his board. "You understand perfectly, Ms. Lauren," he said, his voice dropping slightly, pulling my focus back to him. "You intended to deliver a piece of blackmail to Julian Croft. Instead, you delivered a detailed confession of a federal crime directly into the hands of the man whose associate was defrauded." He paused, letting the clinical horror of his words settle over me. "The Sterling is one of my properties. I have lived in the penthouse for 5 years. Julian Croft has never been a tenant." A wave of nausea washed over me. Julian had given me the address, told me it was his new place. A lie. A final, careless lie to get me to do his dirty work. And now he was gone. And I was left in the wreckage. What are you going to do?" I whispered. The question felt foolish, small. His lips thinned into something that was not quite a smile. It was colder. "That depends entirely on you." The waiter returned with the wine, pouring a splash into Ronan's glass for him to taste. He swirled it, inhaled its scent, and gave a curt nod. The waiter then filled both our glasses with the deep, ruby liquid. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I stared at the wine, at its blood-red color, and felt a chill creep up my spine. Ronan took a sip, his movements deliberate. "Julian Croft is a parasite. He attaches himself to people with more money and less sense, bleeds them dry, and moves on. Usually his victims are content to lick their wounds and learn a lesson. But this time," he said, setting his glass down with a soft, definitive click, "he chose poorly." He leaned forward again, and the opulent restaurant seemed to shrink, focusing into this one single point of terrifying intimacy. "The man whose accounts you so skillfully manipulated is named Alistair Finch. He is not a forgiving man. He doesn't file lawsuits, Ms. Lauren. He sends messages, and the people who deliver those messages are not concerned with collateral damage." My breath caught in my throat. This was no longer about auditors and legal trouble. The fear I had lived with for a year, a fear of discovery, of disgrace, was a pale, pathetic thing compared to the raw terror that was now flooding my veins. "I didn't know," I said, the words tumbling out. "Julian said it was a business dispute, that the man was trying to ruin him over nothing. He swore he would pay it all back." "And you believed him," Ronan finished. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of my foolishness, laid bare on the marble table between us. "You are an accountant, are you not? Good with details, yet you missed the most important one, the character of the man you were protecting." I flinched, the truth of his words a physical blow. Shame warred with my fear. He was right. I had let my history with Julian, the ghost of a love I once thought was real, blind me to the man he had become. The first course arrived, a delicate arrangement of food so beautiful it looked like a painting. I couldn't imagine eating. My stomach was a knot of ice. Ronan picked up his fork and ate with an unhurried grace, as if this were just another Tuesday evening dinner. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Julian, where is he?" Ronan finished his bite before answering. "He's gone, disappeared 2 days ago, the day before you left this." He nudged my letter with a single elegant finger. "On my doorstep. My people are looking for him, so are Finch's." He met my eyes, and the casual way he said "my people" sent another wave of cold dread through me. He wasn't a businessman, or at least, not just a businessman. He was something far more dangerous. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now you have a choice," he said, setting down his fork. The food on his plate was half-eaten. He seemed to have lost interest in it, his full attention once again on me. "Your letter makes you the only tangible link to Croft's crime. Alistair Finch is a man of considerable resources. When his people fail to locate Julian, their search will expand. They will look for friends, associates, lovers. How long do you think it will take them to find you, Seraphine?" He used my first name, and the sound of it in his low, controlled voice was both intimate and threatening. It was the sound of ownership. "You can take your chances," he continued, his tone even. "You can go home, lock your door, and pray they never connect the dots. Or—" He paused, letting the unspoken alternative hang in the air. "Or what?" I breathed. "Or you can accept my protection." The words were so simple, so absurd. Protection. From him? He was the source of my terror, but as I looked into his unblinking, smoke-colored eyes, I understood. He was offering me a shield from a fire he had just shown me was raging right outside my door. It was a terrifying proposition, but the alternative, facing the wrath of a man who didn't file lawsuits, was unthinkable. "Why?" I asked, the question raw with suspicion. "Why would you help me? I helped steal from your associate." "Let's be clear," he said, his voice turning sharp, edged with steel. "Alistair Finch is not my friend. He is a business necessity. His stability ensures my stability. Julian Croft threatened that. You, inadvertently, gave me the key to understanding how. You are now a liability, yes, but you are also an asset. Your knowledge of Croft's methods, of his habits, it could be useful in locating him and recovering what was stolen." He was offering me a cage, a gilded one perhaps, with fine wine and expensive food, but a cage nonetheless. I would be his protected witness, his captive analyst. The price of my safety would be my freedom. For a year, I had lived in a prison of fear, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for an auditor's letter, a phone call from my boss. Now I was being offered a different kind of prison, one with a warden of flesh and blood, but it was also the first offer of safety I'd had in a very long time. The conflict was dizzying. I felt both hunted and, in some strange, terrifying way, seen. "I don't have a choice, do I?" I said, the realization settling like a shroud. "There is always a choice," Ronan replied softly. "But I would advise you to choose wisely." He didn't need to say more. The choice was between the devil I knew, or was beginning to know, and the one I could only imagine. I looked at my letter, a pathetic white flag of surrender on the table. It had found its way to him, and in doing so, had rewritten my entire life. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A flicker of something, satisfaction perhaps, passed through his eyes, there and gone in an instant. He settled back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders seeming to ease. The deal was struck. He picked up his wine glass. "Then eat, Seraphine. It's going to be a long night." The rest of the dinner passed in a surreal haze. Course after exquisite course arrived, and I forced myself to eat, my movements robotic. Ronan spoke very little, asking a few pointed questions about Julian, old addresses, friends, habits, that I answered with a hollow, numb precision. He absorbed the information without comment, filing it away behind those inscrutable eyes. When the meal was over, he placed a black credit card on the bill without looking at it. "Come," he said, standing. I followed him out of the restaurant, the staff parting before us as if we were royalty. The cool night air hit my face, a welcome shock. A sleek black car, so dark it seemed to be carved from Hato, was waiting at the curb. A driver held the back door open. Ronan gestured for me to get in. I slid onto the cool leather seat, and he followed, the door closing with a soft, final thud. We were encased in a world of silence and tinted glass. "My driver will take you," he began. "To my apartment?" I asked, a sliver of hope in my voice. He turned his head slowly, and in the dim light of the passing street lamps, I saw the hard set of his jaw. "No, your apartment is the first place they will look. It is no longer safe." His voice was flat, absolute. "You will be staying somewhere else." The car moved silently through the city, a phantom gliding through streets that had once been my home, but now felt alien and hostile. We drove for 20 minutes, heading toward the newer, more aggressively modern part of the city, where glass towers, pierced the sky. The car slowed and turned into a private underground garage, the gate sliding shut behind us with a heavy groan. We took a private elevator, which opened not into a hallway, but directly into an apartment. A penthouse. The space was vast, a cavern of minimalist design, white walls, dark wood floors, and a floor-to-ceiling wall of glass that looked out over the entire glittering city. It was breathtakingly beautiful and colder than a tomb. I stood in the center of the enormous living room, feeling small and utterly lost. This was my new cage. "There are clothes in the closet," Ronan said from behind me. "Anything else you require, you have only to ask." I turned to face him. He was holding out a small, sleek black phone. "This is for you. It has one number in it. Mine. You will use it for nothing else." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What about my phone? My life?" "Your old life is a liability," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. He held out his other hand, palm up. "Your phone, please." Numbly, I reached into my purse and handed him my lifeline, the device that held my photos, my contacts, my entire existence. He took it without a word. Then, with a casual, almost indifferent strength, he placed his thumbs on the screen and snapped it in half. The crack of the glass was like a gunshot in the silent room. He dropped the two useless pieces onto a marble console table. The finality of the act stole the air from my lungs. My past had just been broken and discarded. "Welcome to your new life, Seraphine," he said, his voice a low murmur in the vast, empty space. He turned and walked to the door, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. He didn't look back. The door clicked shut behind him. The sound of a vault being sealed. I was alone, high above the city, a prisoner in a palace, with nothing but a strange phone and the terrifying certainty that my life was no longer my own. The silence Ronan Kyrell left behind was a living thing. It filled the vast, empty spaces of the penthouse, pressing in on me from the cold marble floors and the impossibly high ceilings. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room for a long time, the two broken halves of my phone on the console table a monument to the life that had just been shattered. Outside the city was a silent, glittering river of light, a world I could see but no longer touch. I was a ghost in a glass tower, and my haunting had just begun. My first instinct was to run. I went to the front door, my hand hovering over the sleek, minimalist handle. I knew it would be locked. I tried it anyway. The solid, unmoving resistance was expected, but it still sent a jolt of pure panic through my system. I was a prisoner. The word, which had been an abstract fear, was now a physical reality. Slowly, numbly, I began to explore my cage. It was less an apartment and more a showroom for a life I could never have. The kitchen was a masterpiece of stainless steel and black granite, with a refrigerator stocked with things I'd never buy. Artisanal cheeses, bottles of sparkling water, exotic fruits. It was food for a stranger. In the bedroom, a king-sized bed was draped in linen so fine they felt like cool water against my skin. The adjoining bathroom was a spa of marble and chrome, with a walk-in closet larger than my old living room. It was in the closet that the full, terrifying scope of his control became clear. It was filled with clothes, dresses, trousers, sweaters, shoes, all in my size. They were beautiful, impeccably tailored pieces in shades of gray, black, and cream. They were also completely anonymous. There was no color, no personality, nothing that felt like me. He hadn't just given me a place to stay. He had curated a new identity for me, one as sterile and controlled as my surroundings. I felt a wave of violation so profound it made me sick. He had stripped me of my past and was now trying to dress me for a future of his own design. The first 24 hours were a blur of silent dread. I didn't sleep. I paced the length of the apartment, from the cold glass wall to the locked front door, a caged animal measuring the dimensions of its new reality. I didn't touch the food. I didn't try on the clothes. I wore the same black dress from the restaurant, a wrinkled and grim reminder of my last moments of freedom. The only thing I clung to was the small black phone he'd given me. It sat on the kitchen counter, a dense, silent object connecting me to my captor. My only link to the outside world was the man who had locked me away from it. By the second day, desperation began to curdle into a strange, reckless anger. I was not a doll to be placed in a dollhouse. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the single contact, Kyrell. My heart pounded. What would I say? plead, scream, demand to be let go? I pressed the call button before I could lose my nerve. It rang only once. Yes? His voice was low, clipped. There was no greeting. It's me, I said, my own voice tight and unfamiliar. A pause. I'm aware. I can't stay here, I said, the words rushing out. You can't just lock me in here. This is kidnapping. This, he replied, his voice dangerously calm, is protection. The alternative is a conversation with Alistair Finch's associates. I assure you, their accommodations are far less comfortable. I want to go home. It was a child's plea, weak and pathetic, and I hated myself for it. You don't have a home anymore, he said, the words as sharp and clean as a scalpel's cut. Not until this is over. Is there anything you require, Seraphine? Or did you just call to state the obvious? The cold dismissal stung, but it also ignited something in me. The fear was still there, a coiled snake in my gut, but my pride, my sense of self, was fighting back. I require a book, I said, the demand taking me by surprise, as much as him. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost feel his surprise through the line. A book, he repeated, his tone flat. Yes, and a notebook, and a pen. If I'm to be a prisoner, I would at least like something to occupy my mind. The silence stretched for a few heartbeats. I thought he might hang up. Then I heard a low, almost inaudible sound, something that might have been a humorless chuckle. I will see what can be done, he said, and the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hand trembling. It was a tiny victory, a pathetic one, but it was mine. I had pushed back, and he hadn't crushed me. For the first time in 48 hours, I felt a flicker of agency. I went into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and ate a crisp green apple, the sharp taste a shock to my system. That night, exhaustion finally claimed me. I showered in the marble tomb of a bathroom and slipped between the cool silken sheets of the bed. But sleep offered no escape. My dreams were a feverish torrent of fear, shadowy men at my old apartment door, Julian's smiling face turning into a sneer, the crack of my phone echoing like a bone breaking. I was running down an endless hallway, the doors identical, my own confession slipping from my fingers and multiplying, covering the floor like dead leaves. I woke with a strangled gasp, my body drenched in a cold sweat. My heart was hammering against my ribs so violently, I thought it might break through. The room was pitch black, the city lights outside a distant, indifferent galaxy. I was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. A sob caught in my throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. And then a voice from the darkness. Breathe, Seraphine, I screamed, scrambling backward until I hit the headboard. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the door. My mind reeled. How? The door was locked. A soft lamp on the bedside table clicked on, casting a pool of warm, golden light. Ronan Kyrell stood there, perfectly still. He was dressed in dark trousers and a simple black shirt, his suit jacket gone. He looked less like a king and more like a shadow given form. How did you get in? I whispered, clutching the sheets to my chest. I have a key, he said, his voice a low, calming rumble. You were screaming. He hadn't come to hurt me. He had come because he heard me. The realization did little to slow the frantic rhythm of my heart. He was still the man who held my life in his hands, an intruder in the most private space I had. He moved slowly, deliberately, toward the bed. I flinched, pressing myself harder against the headboard. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He wasn't looking at me with cold assessment, not this time. There was something else in his smoky eyes, something I couldn't name. It was just a dream, he said quietly. Get out, I managed, the words shaking. He ignored me. He walked to the small kitchenette on the far side of the master suite, opened a cupboard and took out a glass. He filled it with water from a bottle in the mini-fridge and walked back, placing it on the nightstand beside me. His movements were calm, unhurried, designed not to startle. His fingers brushed against mine as he set the glass down. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of electricity through my entire body. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something warm and utterly confusing that shot from my fingertips straight to my chest. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. He saw it. His gaze flickered down to my hand, then back to my face. The air between us grew thick, charged with a sudden, unspoken tension. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, something like sandalwood and night air. In that moment, he was not just my captor. He was a man, and I was a woman. And we were alone in the middle of the night, suspended in a silence that was more intimate than any touch. My fear was still there, a constant hum beneath my skin, but now it was tangled with this new, terrifying awareness. He was the most dangerous man I had ever met, and his quiet presence was the only thing keeping the nightmares at bay. The contradiction was a dizzying, terrifying pull. He held my gaze for a moment longer, his own eyes dark and searching. Then he took a deliberate step back, breaking the spell. The air rushed back into my lungs. "Your books will be here in the morning," he said, his voice once again cool and distant. The moment of connection, if it had even existed, was gone. He turned and walked toward the door, a silhouette against the city lights. He paused with his hand on the handle.
"Try to get some rest, Seraphine," he said without looking back.
"Tomorrow, our work begins." He slipped out as silently as he had entered, the door clicking softly shut behind him, leaving me alone with a glass of water, the ghost of his touch on my skin, and the chilling promise of a new, even more complicated stage of my captivity. The next morning, a discreet knock on the door jolted me from a light, restless sleep. I approached it with the caution of a cornered animal, my heart a nervous flutter against my ribs. Outside, a man in a crisp gray uniform stood, with a small, unsmiling nod. He said nothing, simply handed me a heavy canvas tote bag, and turned to leave. Inside the bag were 3 novels by authors I loved, a thick, leather-bound notebook, and a set of expensive-looking ink pens. Ronan Kirel was a man of his word. He was also a man who paid attention. These weren't just any books. They were specific editions I'd mentioned idly to Julian once, a lifetime ago. The realization sent a complicated chill through me. How did he know? Had he investigated me so thoroughly that he knew my taste in literature, or had he somehow coaxed this detail out of Julian before he disappeared? The thought was a violation, another layer of his control peeled back to reveal an unnerving level of omniscience. He wasn't just protecting me. He was studying me, learning the architecture of my mind. Later that day, he called. "Be ready in an hour." The line went dead before I could respond. An hour later, the same silent man in the gray uniform knocked again, this time to escort me. He led me not to the garage, but to a different elevator, one that went up. It opened directly into another apartment, Ronan's penthouse. If my gilded cage was a minimalist tomb, his home was a fortress. It was darker, richer, furnished with heavy, masculine pieces in dark wood and worn leather. Bookshelves lined an entire wall, filled not with novels, but with leather-bound volumes of history, philosophy, and texts in languages I didn't recognize. This was not a space for show. It was the nerve center of a king. He was standing by a massive window that offered a god's-eye view of the city, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He wore a dark gray suit, tailored to perfection, the picture of restrained power. He turned as I entered, his smoky eyes sweeping over me. I had chosen one of the anonymous cream-colored sweaters and black trousers from the closet, and I felt a fresh wave of resentment at being dressed like one of his possessions. "Good," he said, as if I had passed some unspoken test. "Sit." He gestured to a large mahogany desk, where a sleek laptop sat open next to a stack of files. A second chair was placed opposite his own. The message was clear. My work was indeed beginning. For the next several hours, he questioned me. It wasn't an interrogation, it was a dissection. His questions were precise, relentless, stripping away the emotional chaos of my memories with Julian and leaving only the cold, hard facts. He wanted names, dates, locations. He made me recount every conversation I could remember, every promise Julian had made, every lie he had told. He typed as I spoke, his fingers moving across the keyboard with a quiet, efficient rhythm. He showed me financial statements from Alistair Finch's company, columns of numbers that made my head spin. "Show me," he would say, his voice a low command. "Show me where the money went. Show me the ghost." And I did. With a sickening sense of shame, I pointed out the false accounts, the rerouted transfers, the clever, almost invisible manipulations I had helped create. I was tracing the veins of my own crime, exposing the anatomy of my betrayal. For the man who had the most to lose from it, it was a brutal form of penance. But as we worked, something strange happened. The dynamic between us began to shift. We were no longer just captor and captive. We were two minds focused on a single, complex problem. He was quick, his intellect sharp and incisive. He saw patterns I missed, asked questions that forced me to look at the data in a new light. I found myself, against all reason, impressed by him. He wasn't just a brute who ruled with fear. He had a formidable, disciplined mind. He was sloppy here, I murmured at one point, pointing to a transaction that was too clean, too obvious. He was always arrogant, but this is reckless. He must have been in a hurry. Ronan leaned closer to look at the screen, his shoulder brushing against mine. Again, that jolt, that electric awareness that short-circuited my thoughts. I could feel the warmth of his body, smell that faint, clean scent of his cologne. I held my breath, my entire being focused on that single point of contact. He seemed not to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. "When was this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble beside my ear. 3 weeks ago, I managed to say. My own voice thin. He straightened up, moving away, and the spell was broken. He stared at the screen for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. 3 weeks ago is when Finch started asking questions. Croft knew the walls were closing in. He looked at me then, and his gaze was different. It wasn't assessing or suspicious. It was appreciative. "You are very good at this." The compliment landed with a confusing weight. It was praise for the very skill that had landed me in this mess. It felt like being commended for the beauty of my own shackles. "It doesn't matter," I said, looking away. "It was wrong." "It was," he agreed, without judgment. "But your morality is not my concern. Your ability, however, is." The day settled into a strange, disquieting routine. Each morning, I would be escorted to his penthouse. We would work for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes in a clipped, efficient dialogue. We were hunting Julian through a digital wilderness of his own making. I learned more about Ronan Kyrell in those silent hours than I ever could have in conversation. I saw the way he commanded his people over the phone, his voice never rising above a calm murmur, yet eliciting immediate, unquestioning obedience. I saw the network of power he controlled, a web of influence that stretched into every corner of the city. He was what the whispers on the street called a fixer, a man who operated in the gray spaces between the legal and the lethal. He kept the peace among the city's criminal elements, enforced his own brand of justice, and made fortunes disappear or reappear with a single command. Alistair Finch was not just an associate. He was a component in Ronan's machine, and Julian had thrown a wrench in the works. One afternoon, as we were wrapping up, he took a phone call. His back was to me, but I could see his reflection in the dark glass of the window. His posture was rigid, his voice lower than usual. "Is it done?" he asked. A pause. "And there were no complications?" Another pause, longer this time. A muscle in his jaw clenched. "Good. See that it stays that way." He ended the call and stood motionless for a moment, staring out at the city. When he turned back, his face was a mask of cold control, but I had seen the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of something dark and weary in his eyes. For the first time, I saw the weight of the crown he wore. His kingdom was built on secrets and violence, and he was the one who had to bear its burdens alone. "We're done for today," he said, his voice flat. He walked me to the elevator himself. As the doors slid open, I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to say something, to break through the wall of control he so carefully maintained. "Who are you, Ronan?" I asked, the question soft. He stopped, turning to face me fully. The light from the hallway caught the silver flecks in his smoky eyes. He studied my peak, and for a moment the mask slipped. I saw a flicker of something raw, something human, a loneliness that mirrored my own. "I am the man who reads other people's letters," he said, his voice laced with a weary irony, "and I am the one who deals with the consequences." He gestured for me to step into the elevator. "Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to, Seraphine." The door slid shut, leaving me with the echo of his words and the unsettling image of that crack in his armor. I was beginning to see the man behind the monster, and that, I realized, was far more dangerous than the monster himself. My fear of him was becoming tangled with a reluctant, terrifying empathy. I knew he was a dangerous man, a man who gave orders that resulted in conversations about complications. But I had also seen his discipline, his intelligence, and a glimpse of the burden he carried. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I sat with my notebook, but instead of writing, I replayed our conversations. The way he looked when he was concentrating, the accidental brush of his shoulder against mine. The fear was still a constant companion, but it now had a new and terrifying neighbor. A flicker of attraction. It was insane. It was Stockholm Syndrome. It was a betrayal of every moral compass I had ever possessed. But it was there, a quiet, insistent hum beneath the surface of my dread. He was my captor, my protector, my confessor. He was the most powerful and the most isolated man I had ever met, and he was the only person in the world who knew my deepest, most shameful secret. The connection forged between us in that quiet office was built on a foundation of crime and fear, but it was becoming terrifyingly real. And as I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my beautiful prison, I had to confront a horrifying new truth. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be free of him anymore. The fragile piece of our routine was shattered by a single phone call. It came late one afternoon, as the sky outside the penthouse windows was bruising to purple. We were at his desk, staring at a web of interconnected accounts I had mapped out on the screen, a digital trail of Julian's greed. Ronan's personal phone, a device I'd never seen him use for anything but terse, one-word commands, began to vibrate against the polished mahogany. He answered it without looking at the screen. "Speak." I watched his reflection in the dark glass as he listened. His stillness was absolute, but it was the stillness of a predator that has just caught a scent on the wind. A muscle in his jaw tightened. His eyes, fixed on the cityscape below, narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Location?" he asked, his voice a low growl. He listened for another 10 seconds. "Hold him there. Do not engage. I'm on my way." He ended the call and placed the phone face down on the desk with a quiet, definitive click. The silence that followed was heavier, more charged than any we had shared before. The hunt was over. "They found him," I said. It wasn't a question. "They have," he confirmed, turning from the window to face me. His face was a mask of cold resolve, but his eyes were alive with a dangerous energy. "He's hiding in the old warehouse district by the docks. He's cornered and he's spooked. He tried to buy a boat ticket to get out of the country with the last of Finch's money." My stomach plummeted. Julian, the man of charm and easy smiles, reduced to a rat hiding in the industrial wasteland of the city. There was no pity in me, only a cold, hollow dread. He was real again, not just a ghost in a spreadsheet, and his reality was about to collide with mine. "What will you do?" I whispered. "I will retrieve Alistair Finch's property," he said, his voice leaving no room for interpretation. He wasn't just talking about the money. He walked over to a discreet panel in the wall, pressing it to reveal a hidden safe. He entered a code, and the heavy door swung open. From inside, he removed a sleek black handgun, checking the magazine with an economy of motion that spoke of long and intimate familiarity. The sight of the weapon in his hand, resting against the fine wool of his suit trousers, was a visceral shock. I had known, intellectually, what kind of man he was, but seeing the instrument of his power so plainly was different. It made the violence I had only imagined terrifyingly real. He tucked the gun into a holster at the small of his back, hidden by his suit jacket. He then turned to me, and his gaze was intense, analytical. "He won't come out, he's paranoid. My men can surround the building, but they can't get close without him running or doing something foolish. He's already made one call to a rival of Finch's, trying to sell information in exchange for passage." I knew what was coming before he said it. The realization was a block of ice forming in my chest. "He trusts no one," Ronan continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "Except, perhaps, the woman he thinks still loves him. The woman whose life he ruined." "No," I breathed, shaking my head. "No, I can't." "You can and you will," he said, his voice flat, devoid of sympathy. "This is the price of your protection, Seraphine. I have kept you safe from the consequences of your actions. Now you will help me end this." Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. "He'll know it's a trap. He won't believe me. He will, Ronan countered, walking toward me. He stopped directly in front of my chair, forcing me to look up at him. He was a tower of dark, implacable will. Because you're going to call him. You're going to tell him you have the original ledger, the one you confessed to altering in your letter. You'll tell him it's your only leverage, your only way out, and you're willing to trade it for a share of the money and a way out of the city with him. It was a brilliant, cruel lie. It played on Julian's arrogance, his belief that he could still manipulate me, and his desperation. I was to be the bait, armed with a fiction that was a twisted echo of my own crime. "He'll kill me," I whispered, the words trembling. For the first time, a flicker of something other than cool command crossed Ronan's face. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before his fingers came to rest on my shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding, but it sent a tremor through my entire body. "I will be there," he said, his voice a low, resonant promise. "No one will harm you." He looked into my eyes, and in their smoky depths, I saw the absolute certainty of his own power. It was the promise of a king, a god of this dark underworld, and in my terror, I found a strange, terrifying comfort in it. I had no choice but to believe him. I had no one else. The car ride to the docks was a silent, tense journey through the city's glittering veins. I sat beside him in the back of the black sedan, the scent of leather and his cologne filling the small space. He had given me a burner phone and coached me on what to say. My voice, when I spoke to Julian, had been a marvel of control, a shaky but convincing performance of a desperate woman at the end of her rope. Julian, just as Ronan predicted, had taken the bait. He gave me a location, a derelict cannery on Pier 4, and a time. Now we were minutes away. My hands were freezing, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Ronan was unnervingly calm beside me. He hadn't spoken a word since I'd made the call. He simply stared out the window, his profile etched against the passing lights. As the car slowed, turning into the dark, industrial maze of the docks, he finally turned to me. The area was deserted, a graveyard of rust and brick under the sickly orange glow of a few sodium lamps. "He will be watching," Ronan said quietly. "When you get out, you will walk to the main entrance. You will act afraid but determined. I will be in the shadows to your right. My men have the other exits covered. You will not be alone for a single second." He reached into his jacket and pulled out something small and metallic, a tiny earpiece. "Put this in your left ear. I will be able to hear everything, and I will guide you." My fingers trembled as I fitted the device into my ear. It was cold against my skin. His voice, when it came through a moment later, was a disembodied whisper, a ghost in my head. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," I breathed. The car stopped 100 yards from the cannery. "It's time," he said. I looked at him, my eyes wide with the fear I couldn't hide. He held my gaze, and his expression was unreadable, carved from stone. He gave a single sharp nod. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped out into the cold, salt-laced air. The sound of my heels on the cracked asphalt was unnaturally loud in the silence. The cannery loomed before me, its windows like vacant eyes. I walked, one foot in front of the other, focusing on the sound of Ronan's breathing in my ear, a steady rhythm in the chaos of my own terror. "Good," his voice whispered. "Keep walking. He's in the window on the second floor." I reached the massive rusted doors of the main entrance. One was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the screech of metal on concrete echoing in the cavernous space. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay and stagnant seawater. "Julian," I called out, my voice shaking. "Seraphine?" His voice came from the shadows above, thin and strained. "Did you bring it?" "I have it," I lied, clutching my empty purse to my chest. He emerged from the darkness onto a metal catwalk above me. He was a specter of the man I had known. His clothes were rumpled, his face gaunt and unshaven, his eyes wide and paranoid, darting into the corners of the vast room. "Show me," he demanded. "Give me my share first," I said, the words Ronan had fed me feeling like poison on my tongue. "I'm not a fool anymore, Julian." He let out a harsh, desperate laugh. "You were always a fool, Sari. That's what I loved about you." He started down the metal staircase, his footsteps echoing. "You really thought I'd bring money? You really thought I'd take you with me?" Stay calm, Ronan's voice commanded in my ear. He's stalling. Julian reached the bottom of the stairs and walked toward me, his movements jittery. There is no money, there is no out. There's just this. Finch's men followed you, you stupid girl. I saw them pull up a block away. I called them myself. You're the trade. You for my freedom. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, it stole the air from my lungs. He hadn't just lured me here to rob me. He had served me up as a sacrifice. At that moment, headlights flooded the entrance of the warehouse, and the squeal of tires cut through the night. 2 black SUVs skidded to a halt outside. Doors slammed, and heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel. Julian grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh like talons. He pulled me in front of him, a human shield. They're here, tell them I'm gone, he shrieked, his voice cracking with terror. Get down! Ronan's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar in my ear. Before I could react, the world exploded into motion. A figure moved out of the shadows to my right with impossible speed. It was Ronan. The gun was in his hand, and his face was a mask of lethal focus. He was not the calm, controlled man from the penthouse. He was a killer. He fired twice, not at Julian, but at the catwalk above him. The sound was deafening, a physical blow to my ears. Sparks erupted as the bullets ricocheted, and a heavy chain holding a stack of old pallets snapped. With a groan of tortured metal, the entire load crashed down, blocking the main entrance and the men who were trying to pour through it. It was a diversion. In that split second of chaos, Ronan closed the distance between us. He slammed into Julian, a blur of controlled violence. I was thrown to the side, stumbling and falling hard onto the gritty concrete floor. I looked up just in time to see it. Ronan had Julian pinned against a support pillar, the gun pressed under his jaw. Julian was sobbing, a pathetic, broken sound. 2 of Ronan's men, dressed in black, seemed to materialize from the other shadows, their own weapons drawn, but the men from the entrance were already finding a way around the debris. A shot rang out, and a chip of concrete exploded from the pillar next to Ronan's head. Ronan didn't even flinch. He didn't look at the men advancing on them. He looked at me, his eyes finding mine across the dusty, chaotic space. His expression was cold, hard, and absolute. Close your eyes, Seraphine, he commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. And then, as another shot echoed through the warehouse, he turned his attention back to the whimpering man pinned beneath his hand. He did not close his eyes. He watched, his face carved from ice as he made a choice. The last thing I saw before I squeezed my own eyes shut was the final, terrible tightening of his finger on the trigger. I didn't hear the shot. In the split second before it happened, my mind had already fled, retreating into a silent, black space behind my tightly shut eyes. The world became a roaring in my ears, the cacophony of shouting and echoing gunfire from outside the warehouse, a distant storm. My hands were pressed to the sides of my head, a useless shield against a reality I couldn't bear to witness. I was curled on the cold, gritty concrete, my body trembling uncontrollably, waiting for a final, fatal sound that had already come and gone. Time stretched and warped. It could have been seconds or an eternity before a firm hand gripped my arm. I flinched violently, a strangled cry escaping my lips. Seraphine, it's me, open your eyes. Ronan's voice. It wasn't a command this time. It was a low, urgent plea, cutting through the fog of my terror. I shook my head, unable to obey. I couldn't look. I couldn't see the aftermath of what he had done. To see it would be to make it real, to burn the image into my memory forever. Look at me. His voice was closer now, his hand still firm on my arm. He was kneeling beside me. He moved his other hand to my shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. It's over. You're safe. Safe. The word was a mockery. I had never been in more danger in my entire life. I had just walked into a trap, been betrayed by a ghost, and used as a pawn in a deadly game. And the man telling me I was safe was the most dangerous piece on the board. Slowly, shakily, I lowered my hands. I forced my eyes to open. The first thing I saw was his face, inches from mine. His expression was grim, his jaw tight, but his smoky eyes were fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. They weren't cold or analytical. They were searching, gauging the depth of my shock. Beyond him, the warehouse was a scene of controlled chaos. His men, silent and efficient shadows, were securing the area. The men who had followed me, Finch's men, I presumed, were being disarmed and forced to their knees with a brutal, practiced efficiency. There was no sign of Julian. The space by the pillar where he had been pinned was empty. There was no body, no blood. The relief that washed over me was so profound it was dizzying. He hadn't killed him. My mind seized on the fact, a lifeline in a sea of horror. He had found another way. "Where is he?" I whispered, my voice raw. "Gone," Ronan said, his expression unreadable. "My men have him. He will be dealt with." The euphemism was chilling, but it was a world away from the cold-blooded execution I had braced myself for. He had spared him, or at least, he had spared me from witnessing his end. Ronan stood, pulling me to my feet, with a steady strength that my own trembling legs lacked. I swayed, and his grip on my arm tightened, holding me upright. "We have to leave, now." He guided me away from the center of the warehouse, toward a side exit I hadn't noticed. His body was a shield between me and the scene unfolding behind us. He didn't want me to see. The realization was a strange, confusing flicker of warmth in the ice of my fear. We emerged into the cold night air. The black sedan was waiting, its engine a low, throbbing hum. He opened the back door and practically pushed me inside before sliding in beside me. The car pulled away from the curb before the door was even fully closed, melting into the dark, labyrinthine streets of the Docklands. The silence inside the car was absolute. I stared out the window at the blurred lights, my mind replaying the last few minutes in a fractured, repeating loop. Julian's desperate face, the gun in Ronan's hand, the roar in my ear that was his voice, his command. "Close your eyes." He had protected me, not just from Julian and Finch's men, but from the truth of his own world. I turned to look at him. He was staring straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees. The adrenaline had faded from his face, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. The king was back in his fortress, but the battle had taken its toll. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why did you tell me to close my eyes?" He was silent for a long time. I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough with an emotion I couldn't place. "Because some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and that is a burden I did not want you to carry." His words struck a chord deep inside me, a place that had nothing to do with fear or gratitude. It was a moment of startling, unexpected intimacy. He had seen the lines I couldn't cross, the part of my soul that was not yet corrupted by his world, and he had shielded it. In that single act, he had shown me a part of himself he kept hidden from everyone, a flicker of mercy, a sliver of conscience. "What happens to Julian?" I asked, needing to know. "He will be put on a cargo ship," Ronan said, his tone flat, businesslike again. "When he wakes up, he will be in a country with no extradition treaty and without a penny to his name. The money will be returned to Finch. As far as the world is concerned, Julian Croft has vanished." He had given him a fate worse than death, a living ghost erased from existence. It was a cruel, cold justice, but it was justice nonetheless, and it was a mercy I had not expected. We drove the rest of the way back to the tower in silence. When we reached my apartment, he walked me to the door. I fumbled with the key card, my hands still shaking. "Seraphine," he said. I stopped and turned to face him. We stood under the cool, recessed lighting of the hallway, the silence of the building pressing in around us. "It's over," he said. "You're free to go." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Free. It was what I had wanted, what I had begged for, but now the thought of it was terrifying. Go where? Back to my old apartment, my old life, pretending the last few weeks had never happened? How could I ever go back to being the woman I was before? How could I unknow the things I now knew, unfeel the things he had made me feel? "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice small. "It means the arrangement is concluded," he explained, his voice patient, as if explaining something to a child. "Finch has his money, Julian Croft is gone. The threat to you is neutralized. You can return to your life. I will have your personal effects delivered from your old apartment in the morning. My driver will take you wherever you wish to go." He was letting me go, dismissing me. My purpose was served. I was no longer an asset. Just a liability, a loose end. The realization was a sharp, painful ache in my chest. I had been a piece in his game, and now that the game was won, I was being put back in the box. I looked into his eyes, searching for something, anything. A flicker of reluctance, a hint of regret. But they were guarded, closed off. The smoke-colored walls back up. He was Ronan Kyrell again, the city's silent king, and I was just an ordinary woman who had stumbled into his kingdom. "So that's it," I said, a bitter anger rising through the hurt. "You break my phone, lock me in a tower, drag me into the middle of a gang war, and then just say, 'You're free to go,' as if you've done me a favor?" "I kept you alive," he said, his voice dropping, a dangerous edge creeping into it. "Do not mistake my protection for a favor. It was a necessity, and now it is no longer necessary." His coldness was a slap in the face. He was right. He owed me nothing. I was the one who wrote the letter, who committed the crime, who slid my confession under the wrong door. He had simply dealt with the consequences, just as he said he would. But it felt like more than that had passed between us. The late nights working at his desk, the terror in the warehouse, the moment he had shielded my eyes, had that all meant nothing to him? I felt a reckless, desperate need to make him feel something, to break through that impenetrable control one last time. "Is that all I was to you?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and a pain I didn't want to acknowledge. "A necessity, a tool to get what you wanted?" He stared at me, his expression hardening, a muscle worked in his jaw. "What else would you be?" The words were brutal, designed to cut, to push me away, and they did. They confirmed every fear I had. I was a fool who had started to see a man where there was only a monster, who had mistaken a shared crisis for a genuine connection. Tears of humiliation and fury pricked at the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give him the satisfaction. I lifted my chin, meeting his cold gaze with one of my own. "Thank you for your protection, Mr. Kyrell," I said, my voice dripping with ice. "I won't be requiring any of your services again." I turned, swiped the keycard, and pushed the door open. I walked into the apartment without looking back, slamming the door shut behind me. The sound echoed in the silent, empty room. I leaned against the door, my heart hammering, listening. I expected to hear his footsteps walking away, the ding of the elevator, but there was only silence. He was still out there, just standing, waiting, for what, I didn't know. My anger began to crumble, replaced by a deep, aching void. I had made my choice. I had chosen freedom, but as I stood alone in the beautiful, sterile cage that had been my sanctuary, I realized the truth. He wasn't the one who was trapped. I was. Trapped by a memory, a feeling, a connection to a man I should have only ever feared. And walking away from him felt less like an escape and more like leaving a vital part of myself behind in the dark. That night, I woke up from another nightmare, my heart pounding, the sheets damp with cold sweat. I was back in the warehouse, but this time, when Ronan commanded me to close my eyes, I couldn't. I was forced to watch. I sat up in bed, gasping for air, the phantom sound of a gunshot echoing in my ears. That was the moment I knew. I could not go back. My old life was a ghost, and trying to live in it was a slow, suffocating death. The safety I had craved was an illusion. The only time I had felt truly safe in the last year was when I was standing in the shadow of the most dangerous man I had ever met. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The next morning, I packed a single bag, not with the things from my past, but with the anonymous, elegant clothes from the penthouse closet. They were my armor now. I wrote a letter to my landlord, breaking my lease. I wrote a resignation email to my old firm. I was systematically dismantling the life of Seraphine Lorin because she no longer existed. I didn't know where I was going, maybe to a new city, a new country, somewhere I could be someone else, someone who hadn't seen the things I'd seen. As I was taping up the last box of my old belongings to be put in storage, the buzzer rang. My blood ran cold. I hadn't had a visitor in weeks. I answered the intercom, my voice trembling. "Who is it?" "Delivery for Ms. Lorin," a neutral voice replied. Hesitantly, I buzzed him in. A few moments later, there was a soft knock. I opened the door a crack to see a uniformed courier holding a small, flat black box. about the size of a book. It was sealed with no markings or return address. I took it and locked the door, my heart hammering. I sat on the floor amidst the boxes and stared at it. The box was made of the same heavy, expensive cardstock as the first envelope he had ever sent me. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was my phone. My old phone, the one he had snapped in half. It was whole again. There wasn't a scratch or a crack on it. It looked brand new. I pressed the power button, and the screen lit up with my old lock screen, a photo of a sunset over a lake, from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. It was impossible. A message, a display of power so absolute it defied reality. He could not just break things, he could unbreak them. Underneath the phone was a single keycard, identical to the one for the penthouse I had lived in. And beneath that, a small, folded note. The handwriting was the same precise, commanding script from the dinner invitation. The message was only 5 words long. There is always a choice. I held the note in my hand, the heavy paper cool against my skin. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact, an echo of the first real conversation we'd ever had. He was giving me back the choice he had taken away. I could take my old life, now miraculously repaired, and walk away forever. Or I could take the key, open a different door, and step back into his world, not as a prisoner, but as something else. I looked around the small, cluttered apartment, at the boxes filled with the ghosts of a woman I no longer was. Then I looked down at the key in my palm. It felt heavy, weighted with the promise of danger, of power, of a life lived in the shadows beside a man who understood them. A life where I would never be bored, and never truly safe. A life where I might, for the first time, not be alone. I closed my hand around the key, the cool metal pressing into my skin, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence in the room didn't feel like fear. It felt like a beginning,